Hello, welcome back. My name is Johanna, and today we are starting the psychology unit. I took a little break because summer vacation has just started, and I decided that I was going to rewrite my notes in every single subject and every single chapter. And yeah, that sounds a little insane, but that's what I decided to do. So I decided that I will attempt to make a video in a different way with a physical book instead of the iPad. However, if this doesn't work, then I will obviously go back to using the iPad. As I say always, I have no credentials. I am just using the official books, the IB books that are given to us by the school. And this is my summary of Chapter 1 of Psychology, only the standard level content because there are actually 4 higher level parts and they take quite a lot of time. So that will be next. Chapter 1 in psychology is called Research in Psychology. 1.1 is called Introducing Psychology. So first of all, what is psychology? There are many definitions, but the IV defines psychology as the study of the mind and behavior. So even though it's not within the actual definition, it is important that psychology is seen as scientific, which means that it is a systemic and controlled study, and that correlational or cause and effect relationships are identified through the study. The mind refers to the part of the brain that reasons, thinks, feels, wills, perceives, and judges, and behavior is defined as the coordinated response of a whole living organism to external or internal stimuli. So now that you actually know what psychology is, it's time to take a look at what psychologists actually study. So they study cognitive processes, which is memory, perception, attention, decision-making, thinking, and reasoning. This is essentially how your brain takes existing knowledge to create new knowledge. Physiology, which refers to our biological systems. For instance, photosynthesis is a physiological process. I mean, obviously that is not in humans, but I'm just saying like a biological system. Attitudes refers to feelings of like or dislike towards a person, place, or item. Emotions, which is combinations of physiological and cognitive processes. Now, another big thing that is studied within psychology is the nature and nurture argument. Now, previously this was seen as a huge debate whether nature or nurture play a bigger role in people's behavior, like effects on people's behaviors. However, today it is very much agreed that both nature and nurture do play a role. For instance, this could be the environment you grow up in versus your genetics, which one determines who you are and how you behave. Previously, this was a huge debate, but now people see it as both. So within psychology, there are many approaches. The 3 approaches that we'll be focused on in the IB psychology course are the biological approach, which focuses on physiology, the cognitive approach, which focuses on mental processes like memory, thinking, perception, and attention, and the socio-cultural approach, which focuses on how environments and cultures affect behavior. So in psychology, there are a lot of theories and empirical studies. A theory is an explanation for a psychological phenomenon. So a lot of anecdotal data is used. Anecdotal data is when personal experiences are used as evidence. Empirical evidence, on the other hand, is observations or evidence found through experiments. Now, when looking at theories and studies in psychology, you have to be sure to evaluate them. There is a teacup method for evaluating studies in psychology. You have to make sure that it is testable, that the evidence exists and makes sense, that there is an application for the study, that the concepts have been defined, that it is unbiased, and that it predicts a behavior. For instance, Freud had a theory called the trauma of birth, which essentially stated that going from a safe space like a womb and being birthed into the world is very traumatic and can affect our behavior in large ways. However, this is not a testable theory because to test it, you would both need someone who has been birthed, lived through the trauma, which, yes, that is easy to find, but you would also have to find someone who hasn't, which would be impossible because then you would need someone who hasn't been born, which I'm pretty sure you all can see the issue with that. So, in this chapter, they also go through a assortment of different career options within psychology. However, I will not be going through each one of these and what they mean. You could Google these words that I have here under the career options headline, and along with the word psychology, and you could read up on that yourself if it interests you. But essentially, what is said here is that you can work in many different places. The last part of chapter 1.1 is about psychological theories in practice. So, the book states that as an Ivy learner, you're gonna have to begin with some studies, and there are some simple questions that you have to decide. Do you believe in hard work or talent? So, this study goes into that. Dwerk and Blackwell Dwerk. I'm not really sure how to say that word. It's someone's name. This study was made in 2007. I said Steppen. Great. The aim of the study was to find the importance of the mindset in explaining successes. So there were fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. So in the fixed mindset, you believed that intelligence was just something you were born with. It's a talent, not something that can be improved. Meanwhile, in the growth mindset, you believe that you can improve these skills and become better. So the procedure was that low achieving students aged 12 to 13 were given an introduction to the brain and study skills. Half of them had a neutral session, and the other half had a lecture on how intelligence can be developed, just like how you exercise to build your muscles, for instance. The results were that the first half did not improve at all, and the second half were more motivated and improved a lot. This clearly shows that with a growth mindset, you are able to achieve more. Now, as the question said in before, do you believe in hard work or talent? This study would therefore suggest that hard work would be a more appropriate approach. So now we're going to go into chapter 1.2, which is quantitative research methods. So quantitative is research that generates numerical data. So this includes laboratory experiments. So you need an independent and a dependent variable. The independent variable is manipulated. This is what is changed in an experiment, and the dependent variable is what is being measured in an experiment. So it is also important that the variables are operationalized, which means that they are clearly measurable. You need control variables. These are the aspects of an experiment that always stay the same. The experiment also needs to be standardized, which means that it's easily replicated, and participants should be randomly allocated to the different conditions within an experiment. So let's say half of the group does a test while listening to music, while the other half does a test while not listening to anything. Then the independent variable would be the sound, so the music or no music, and the dependent variable would be how good they do on the test. And participants should be randomly put into either the music group or the non-music group. There are also field experiments, which are said to have higher ecological value. This essentially means that they are more realistic to real life, which means that the behavior that is displayed in the experiment may be more appropriate to like what would actually happen in real life. However, there are limitations. They cannot be as easily replicated. They cannot control extraneous variables, which are undesirable variables that influence the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. There are also ethical considerations. For example, you need informed consent and debriefing after an experiment. Debriefing is basically explaining what has just happened, and consent is, asking for permission. There is a rule, however, which is that if you observe people in places where they are expected to be observed, it is fine. So, for instance, if you're at a train station where there are already cameras set up for safety, then it could be seen as more ethical to have a field experiment there because they are already expected, they already know that they're being filmed in some sense. So, quasi and natural experiments. So, in these experiments, the participants are not randomly allocated, and these experiments only imply causation. So they can't determine causation, but they imply causation. So if you do one of these experiments, you can then further it to see what happens. So in the quasi experiments, participants are grouped based on a trait. So for instance, they are all women, or they are all 13, or they are all whatever. And in natural experiments, the IV is experimental in nature. Environmental in nature. So you measure the data before and after it has happened. For instance, you could talk about pollution and measure how people behaved before a certain amount of pollution happened and after a certain amount of pollution happened. So, correlational studies. So, there is no experiment, but there is data that shows a relationship between two variables. So, there is no independent variable being manipulated, so no causal can be determined. So, I can't say, oh, this is the reason why it happened. So, essentially, you could collect a bunch of data that already exists. For instance, you know how they always talk about how Google is like stealing all our data and stuff. They could use that data to make correlational studies, technically. And of course, correlation does not equal causation, and there are a bunch of random correlations you can find, like amount of ice creams eaten and drownings. And you could be like, oh, there's a correlation, but that doesn't actually mean anything. Now, bidirectional ambiguity is a problem that correlational studies have. This means that it's impossible to know what variable affected what. So you have to remember that a positive correlation looks like this and a negative correlation looks like that. So essentially how the graphs would look. A positive correlation means that as x increases, y increases. A negative correlation means that as y increases, x decreases. So demand characteristics is a big problem in psychology. This is when participants act differently simply because they know they are being studied. Some of these are expectancy effect. Participants discern the hypothesis with the goal of helping the researcher. So this is if you were to figure out what you think the researcher wants and then to do it just because you're like, oh, I want to help the researcher. So the screw you effect, yes, it's actually called the screw you effect, is when you discern in order to destroy credibility. So this is basically when you want to do the opposite of what you think the researcher is looking for. The social desirability effect is when participant tries to make themselves look good. So this is essentially answering in a way that would make you seem like, oh, I'm a good person. Like I do all this stuff. So you could be lying or something because you want to look good. So researcher bias is also a part of demand characteristics. This is when the researcher sees what he/she or they, whoever, is looking for. They use double-blind controls to avoid this. This essentially means that they have both researchers and conditions that are assigned randomly so that you don't know like what is connected to what. Participants' variability. This is when the participants do something that would affect the dependent variable, which is what you're measuring. So you use random allocation to avoid this situation. Artificiality, this means that if the situation is not like real life, which means that your experiment could be seen as useless. Now it's time for the last chapter of this video, which is 1.3, Qualitative Research Methods. So qualitative data arose because of a concern about artificiality and lack of ecological value. So what this means is that it arose because people were scared that the research being found was not actually relevant to real life. So qualitative data uses an inductive approach. This means that the research is guided by a research question that is open-ended and invites descriptions and explanations. Essentially, what you're looking for is how people experience their everyday lives. So this is not numerical data, this is textual data. No variables are defined, and no cause and effect relationship can be defined either. You gather data and then find meaning. So essentially go in the other option. In the other direction than with quantitative data. You acknowledge that the interpretation of events, both by the participant and by the researcher, are a part of the research process. This means that qualitative data is somewhat subjective, and it is also very time consuming. So quantitative data uses the deductive approach. This means that it's guided by a hypothesis and tested against empirical evidence, which means that it's more objective. In qualitative data, you use many methods to research. One of those methods is interviews. In interviews, interview schedules are very important. These are the schedules that plan for how you should conduct your interview. There are different types of interviews as well. Now, there is something called the interviewer effect, which is when you get a distorted response due to the interviewer's personality or appearance or social style, which doesn't mesh well with the participant. For instance, let's say the participant doesn't like your appearance and thus shies away from digging deep and answering in very much detail. So that is one issue with interviews. A type of interview is a structured interview. This means that the schedule states what question to ask and in what order. This type of interview is easy to analyze. It is very standardized. You can use a larger sample because it's not as time consuming, and it can be seen as artificial. Now, an unstructured interview means that the schedule only specifies the topic and the time available. It is more difficult to analyze. A semi-structured interview has the schedule involves open-ended questions, which means it's more open to further questions, like you can ask additional questions and such. However, you have to decide whether to have a one-on-one interview or a focus group. A focus group is essentially interviewing in a group instead of one-to-one. However, a focus group can lead to the conformity effect, which is that people simply just follow the group. You want to fit in, so you answer in a way that makes you fit in. Another way research can be done in qualitative is observations. There are naturalistic observations, which means that they are in natural settings. Researcher triangulation is usually used, so that this means that multiple researchers come together and compare the results to make sure that they are both seeing the same thing. There is participant versus non-participant observations, which is that the researcher is either a part of the group being observed or not. Reactivity is when you change behavior when you're being observed, and therefore there is also covert and overt observations. So this is if the participants know they are being observed or not. Covert means that they don't know, and overt means that they know they are being observed. So you can also use surveys, which is collecting information from a large and dispersed group. Often questionnaires are used with very closed questions, which makes it way easier to analyze. When making these closed questions, sometimes the Likert scale is used. This is essentially giving options, like making a scale, and you can answer the question with, I never do that, I seldom do that, I sometimes do that, I often do that, I always do that. For instance, something in that sense. There is also a response bias when it comes to surveys, which is when you give the right, quote unquote, right answer to the researcher. So this is what you think that they want. The last research method we will be talking about is case studies. Case studies are often holistic, which means that you look at the whole instead of the individual pieces. You can use both qualitative and quantitative data in a case study. Usually, method triangulation is used, which means that you use multiple methods to research one specific topic. It is not possible to recreate a case study due to the uniqueness and the ethics. Reliability is said to be low because you can't recreate it. However, if it is corroborated, then the reliability is high. So a case study essentially could be looking at one person's life and seeing what diagnosis they have, and so on and so forth. And that is it for this episode of psychology, and all for standard level chapter 1. Next episode will be all of the higher level concepts in chapter 1. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, and comment. And you can follow me at Johanna Frennert on Instagram if you want. And goodbye. I hope you learned something, and I hope this was useful.